Blood never smelled like copper when it belonged to a cult. It smelled like crushed mint and battery acid. Sitting in the sterile, broadcast chair, Oliver could still taste it coating the back of his throat. They asked him what it was like, fighting alongside Terran infantry on the ash plains. They expected tales of galactic heroism, of shining lasers and brotherhood. They were fools. Oliver leaned into the microphone to tell them how monsters save lives. Mud filled Oliver's mouth, tasting of sulfur and decaying fungi. He didn't spit it out. Spitting required moving his jaw, and any movement might draw the attention of the clicking horrors marching above the trench. Rain, thick and oily, battered against the cracked composite of his back plating. He pressed his face deeper into the mire, ignoring the sting of the acidic water seeping into the exposed flesh around his neck. Beside him, Blake was dying. It wasn't a quiet, dignified death. Blake's secondary lung had been punctured by a shredder round 20 minutes ago, and every breath he took produced a wet, whistling suck that sounded like a boot pulling out of a bog. Oliver squeezed his eyes shut. His 3 hearts drummed an erratic, unsynchronized rhythm against his ribs. He was terrified. Not the clean, noble fear of a soldier ready to meet the void, but the ugly, bowel-loosening terror of prey cornered in a hole. He wanted to run. He wanted to burrow into the earth until he hit the core of this miserable planet. Instead, he just shivered, his 4 hands clamped over his audio receptors to drown out the noise. The enemy, the Creel, were close now. He could smell their exhaust vents. It was a cloying stench, like burning hair mixed with stale grease. Their mechanical limbs punched into the soil with heavy, rhythmic thuds. Thud. Click. Whir. Thud. They were sweeping the trench line, systematically impaling whatever was left of Oliver's platoon. "Oliver!" Blake gasped, his voice a bubbling whisper. A hand weakly clawed at Oliver's shoulder. Oliver didn't move. He held his breath. "Stop talking," he pleaded silently. "Please just die quietly. They'll hear you." Shame burned hot in Oliver's chest, bitter and sharp, but survival instincts crushed it down. He was a communications officer, not a frontline shock trooper. He was never supposed to be in the mud. He was supposed to be in orbit, sipping filtered water and coordinating drop coordinates. But the orbital guns had missed, the Creel had flanked, and now he was drowning in a ditch while his squad mates bled out. The thudding stopped. Right above them, Oliver's stomachs plummeted. A shadow fell over the trench, blocking out the sickly orange glow of the atmosphere. Mud rained down on his neck as a heavy, multi-jointed metallic leg stepped onto the edge of the crater. This was it. The end. Oliver waited for the spike to drive through his spine. He couldn't even muster a prayer. His mind was entirely consumed by the physical sensation of the cold mud and the violent trembling of his own limbs. Then, the sky tore open. It didn't sound like artillery. It sounded like the atmosphere itself was being ripped in half. A deafening, concussive crack echoed across the plains, followed by a roar so intense it made Oliver's teeth ache. The pressure wave hit a second later, blowing the acidic rain sideways and flattening the mud. Oliver cracked one eye open. The clouds above were glowing white-hot, streaked with violent streaks of re-entry fire. Drop pods. Not the sleek, aerodynamic darts of the Colt fleet, which glided in on repulsor lifts. These were blunt, ugly, heavily armored bricks, falling out of the sky with zero grace. They weren't flying. They were falling with calculated aggression. They slammed into the earth with the force of meteor strikes. The ground bucked. Oliver was thrown upward, his chest slamming hard against the side of the trench. The Creel standing above them was caught dead center of a landing zone. A drop pod the size of a transport truck smashed down directly on top of it, driving the machine deep into the crust of the planet in a spray of vaporized mud and shattered metal. Steam hissed violently from the scorch marks on the pod's hull. The heat radiating off the metal instantly baked the surrounding mud into cracked clay. For a long, agonizing second, nothing happened. The battlefield was completely silent, save for the crackling of cooling metal and the hissing of the rain. Then the explosive bolts on the pod's doors blew. There was no smooth hydraulic hiss, no elegant ramp extending to the ground. The heavy steel door was simply blown outward by crude, controlled detonations, sending it tumbling through the air to crush a nearby cluster of fungal trees. Smoke, thick and smelling of ozone, cordite and sweat, poured out of the dark interior. Through the haze, heavy boots stepped onto the baked earth. The humans had arrived. Oliver watched, paralyzed, as the figures emerged. They were encased in armor that looked like it had been hammered together from scrap metal and sheer spite. It wasn't painted in camouflage or ceremonial colors. It was dull gray, scarred with deep gouges and splashed with dried fluids from previous deployments. They didn't move with the synchronized grace of a military unit. They moved like brawlers stepping out of an alleyway, heavy, deliberate, and radiating an aura of suppressed violence. The first one out carried a weapon that made Oliver's eyes widen in disbelief. The cult used directed energy, clean, precise, silent beams that cauterized wounds instantly. This human carried a massive, blocky rifle connected to an ammunition drum the size of Oliver's torso. It looked heavy enough to snap a colt's spine. A Creel drone, recovering from the shockwave, scrambled over a mound of debris, its laser cutters glowing a lethal purple. The human, a massive shape with the name Hayes stenciled in chipped white paint on his chest plate, didn't even aim down the sights. He just leveled the weapon from his hip and squeezed the trigger. The noise was apocalyptic. Oliver screamed, clapping his hands over his ears, but it didn't help. The sound didn't just assault the ears, it hammered against the chest, vibrating through fluid and bone. It was a rapid, staccato series of explosions, boom, 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 that spat a solid stream of kinetic slugs. The Creel drone didn't just break, it shredded. The heavy armor plating that had effortlessly deflected cult plasma fire buckled and tore under the sheer kinetic force of the human weapon. Shrapnel, oil, and synthetic fibers sprayed in a wide arc. The drone was blown backward, physically lifted off its mechanical legs by the impact, before collapsing into a twitching heap of scrap. "Contact front!" Hayes roared. His voice was a harsh, guttural bark that carried over the din of the rain. More humans poured from the pods. They didn't take cover. They advanced. Oliver pressed himself flat, watching in horrified fascination as the battle devolved into a slaughter. The Creel were designed to fight logical enemies. They calculated trajectories, flanked predictably, and targeted weak points. The humans defied every tactical algorithm. They were reckless. They were loud. They were brutally inefficient, relying on overwhelming kinetic destruction rather than precision. A human designated Riley hoisted a long, cylindrical tube onto her shoulder. She fired. A rocket, trailing a thick plume of grey smoke, spiraled wildly across the battlefield before slamming into a cluster of Creel soldiers. The explosion wasn't a neat sphere of plasma. It was a jagged blossom of fire, dirt, and raw concussive force. Oliver watched pieces of Creel armor rain down like hail 50 meters away. But it wasn't the weapons that turned Oliver's stomachs. It was what happened when the weapons ran dry. Through the smoke, a specialized Creel stalker, a biomechanical nightmare designed for close-quarters butchery, leapt over a ruined tank, landing directly in front of a human scout named Bennett. Bennett's rifle clicked dry. An empty magazine dropped to the mud. Oliver expected the human to retreat, to call for support, to die screaming as the stalker raised its serrated forelimbs. That was what a colt would do. Instead, Bennett let the rifle drop to its sling. He didn't step back. He stepped in. The human ducked under the initial swing of the serrated blade, closing the distance so fast the stalker couldn't track him. Bennett's hand shot out, grabbing the joint of the stalker's mechanical arm. With a grunt that sounded more animal than sapient, Bennett twisted his torso, using the weight of his own heavily armored body as leverage. There was a sickening, metallic snap. Bennett broke the joint backward. Oliver felt his primary stomach heave. He turned his head and threw up into the mud, a miserable string of green bile. He couldn't look away, though. His eyes were locked on the carnage. The stalker shrieked, a digital, tearing sound, and thrust its other limb toward Bennett's chest. The blade sank deep into the gap between the human's chest plate and waist guard. Oliver stopped breathing. That was a fatal blow. The stalker's blades were coated in neuroacid. Bennett was dead. But Bennett didn't fall. The human let out a roar of pain, a terrifying wet sound that echoed with raw fury. He didn't try to pull away from the blade. He grabbed the stalker by its primary optical cluster. His heavily armored gauntlet squeezed. Synthetics shattered. The stalker thrashed, but Bennett held firm, drawing a heavy, ugly slab of metal from his thigh sheath. A trench knife, jagged and thick. He plunged it into the stalker's neck joint. Not once, not twice. Bennett stabbed the machine 6 times in rapid succession, tearing cables and severing hydraulics until the stalker's head hung loosely by a few sparking wires. Only then did Bennett step back. He looked down at the blade embedded in his own gut. He grabbed the hilt, let out a short, sharp exhale, and yanked it out. Dark red blood poured down his armor, mixing with the rain. Bennett didn't collapse. He stumbled, coughed a spray of crimson onto the mud, and reached into a pouch on his belt. He pulled out a canister, jammed it directly into the open wound, and pressed a button. A thick, expanding foam hissed loudly, filling the gap in his armor and sealing the bleeding flesh beneath. Bennett patted the foam, picked up his rifle, slammed a fresh magazine into it, and racked the bolt. Oliver was trembling so hard his joints ached. These weren't soldiers. They were apex predators, perfectly adapted to chaos. They didn't feel pain the way normal beings did. They used it as fuel. They didn't fear death. They simply refused to acknowledge it until their bodies literally fell apart. The gunfire eventually died down, replaced by the hissing of the rain on hot metal and the crackle of burning oil. The battlefield was unrecognizable. What had been a neatly entrenched defensive line was now a cratered, smoking ruin, littered with shattered creel frames. Oliver slowly pushed himself up on trembling arms. He was covered in mud, vomit, and the pale blue blood of his dead squadmates. The silence was heavier than the gunfire. It pressed against his eardrums, broken only by the sounds of the humans. They weren't celebrating. They weren't cheering. They were walking through the wreckage with casual indifference, putting single rounds into any creel chassis that still twitched. Hayes approached the edge of the trench where Oliver was hiding. The human's armor was scorched black on one side. His helmet was gone, revealing a face completely lacking in aesthetic grace. The skin was pale, smeared with soot and blood. Short, bristly hair covered his scalp, and a fresh gash ran down his cheek, leaking red fluid. Hayes peered into the trench, his eyes locked onto Oliver. Oliver froze. He felt like a small rodent caught in the gaze of a hunting bird. He pressed his back against the mud wall, raising his 4 hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender, even though they were supposed to be on the same side. Hayes didn't raise his weapon. He stared at Oliver, then at the ruined body of Blake nearby. The human's face didn't register disgust or pity. It registered cold calculation. "You intact, Bug?" Hayes asked. His voice was exhausted, gravelly. The translation matrix in Oliver's ear implant converted the words, but the tone needed no translation. It was the tone of a creature entirely desensitized to horror. Oliver tried to speak, but his throat was too dry. He managed a weak nod. Hayes reached down, extending a hand. Oliver looked at the appendage. The gauntlet was heavily scarred. 2 of the fingers were completely coated in the black, oily fluid that served as blood for the creel. The human was offering help with a hand that had just beaten a machine to death. Hesitantly, Oliver reached up with 2 of his own slender, trembling hands. He grasped Hayes's wrist. The human pulled. There was no strain, no effort. Hayes hauled Oliver's entire weight out of the trench and onto the flat ground with a single, casual jerk. Oliver stumbled, his weak legs giving out. He collapsed into the mud at Hayes's boots. "Get up," Hayes said, not unkindly, but firmly. "Ground's cold. You'll freeze." Oliver scrambled upright, wrapping his arms around his own torso. He looked around the clearing. Riley was sitting on a ruined creel chassis, her helmet off. She was holding a thin white stick between her lips, setting the end of it on fire with a small metallic device. She inhaled the smoke deeply and let out a long sigh. Bennett was sitting against a drop pod. His armor was off his chest, revealing pale skin covered in dark hair. Another human was wrapping thick white bandages around the massive puncture wound in his gut. "Tighten it," Bennett grunted, his face pale, sweat cutting tracks through the grime on his forehead. The medic pulled the bandage viciously tight. Bennett didn't scream. He bared his flat, omnivorous teeth, let out a sharp hiss, and then forced a laugh, a jagged, ugly sound. "Missed the liver. Lucky bastard." They were joking. Oliver stared in absolute horror. One of their pack was severely wounded, bleeding profusely, surrounded by the mangled corpses of their enemies, and they were exchanging casual banter. The air reeked of copper and void fluid, of vaporized bone and melting synthetic armor. It was the smell of a slaughterhouse, and these humans were sitting in the middle of it, breathing it in like it was a spring breeze. Hayes clapped a heavy hand on Oliver's shoulder, making the colt flinch violently. "Drink," Hayes said, pressing a dented metal canteen against Oliver's chest. Oliver took it with shaking hands. He unscrewed the cap and smelled it. It was water, but it smelled heavily of iron and dirt. He took a sip anyway. It was cold and bitter, but it cleared the taste of battery acid from his tongue. "Thank you," Oliver stammered, his vocal cords clicking nervously. Hayes just grunted, turning his attention to the sky. "More inbound in 20. Better get your comms up, Bug. Tell your fleet we need a dust-off." Oliver looked at the humans. They were broken, bleeding, and filthy. They fought like savages, using brute force and crude kinetic instruments. They broke bones with their bare hands. They bled red, breathed smoke, and laughed at death. In the academy, Oliver had been taught that the cult were the pinnacle of galactic evolution, civilized and refined. The humans were considered a blunt instrument, a desperate measure hired by the coalition because they were cheap and numerous. But standing there in the ash and the blood, Oliver realized the horrifying truth. The humans weren't a blunt instrument. They were an infection of raw, unyielding violence, and in a galaxy trying to consume the cult alive, this terrifying, ugly infection was the only thing standing between them and extinction. Oliver clutched the canteen tightly. He wasn't safe because the humans were noble allies. He was safe because, For some unfathomable reason, the deadliest predators in the galaxy had decided to protect him. Ash drifted down from the poisoned sky like grey, gritty snow, settling onto the cooling corpses of the Creel machines. It stuck to the wet mud, creating a thick, cement-like slurry that coated everything. Oliver sat shivering against the cracked hull of the drop pod, watching the human medic work. His name was Carter. He didn't look like a healer. His armor was just as scarred as the others, his face smeared with soot, and his hands were thick and calloused. He knelt in the mud beside Bennett, pinning the wounded soldier to the ground with a heavy knee pressed against his thigh. "Hold still, you stubborn idiot," Carter muttered, a flashlight gripped tightly between his teeth. Bennett let out a low, vibrating groan, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edges of his shattered chest plate. The expanding foam Carter had used earlier was a temporary fix, designed only to stop the immediate hemorrhaging. Now the medic was digging it out. Oliver clamped his lower set of hands over his mandibles, fighting down another wave of nausea. The cult medical doctrine dictated sterile fields, localized stasis fields, and automated laser suturing. If a cult suffered a traumatic torso wound, they were frozen until a surgical drone could rebuild the tissue at a cellular level. Carter was using a pair of rusted, serrated pliers. With a wet, tearing sound, Carter ripped a chunk of blood-soaked foam from Bennett's gut. The human beneath him convulsed, a sharp hiss of air escaping his gritted teeth, but he didn't scream. "Got the bleeder," Carter mumbled around the flashlight. He dropped the pliers into the mud and pulled a heavy metallic device from his thigh pouch. It looked like a tool used for repairing engine blocks, not flesh. He pressed the cold metal directly against the open, pulsing wound. Clack, clack, clack. Heavy industrial staples drove deep into Bennett's flesh, forcing the edges of the torn muscle and skin together. Blood welled up around the metal prongs, thick and violently red. Carter didn't pause. He grabbed a tube of something that smelled intensely of industrial solvent and squeezed a thick bead of translucent glue directly over the staples. "Breathe," Carter ordered, sitting back on his heels and wiping a smear of blood across his own forehead. Bennett let out a long, ragged exhale, his head falling back against the pod. His skin was the color of spoiled milk, covered in a sheen of cold sweat. "You're a butcher, Doc." "You're alive," Carter replied flatly. "Take your stims." He tossed a small, auto-injecting plastic cylinder onto Bennett's chest. Without hesitating, Bennett grabbed it, jammed it into his own thigh, and pressed the trigger. The effect was immediate and horrifying. Oliver watched in stunned silence as the dying human's biology was forcibly overridden by chemical stimulants. Bennett's pupils dilated until his eyes were almost entirely black. The shallow, labored breathing turned into deep, aggressive pulls of air. The tremors in his hands vanished, replaced by a rigid, white-knuckled tension. The stimulants didn't heal him. They simply ordered his central nervous system to ignore the fact that he was bleeding to death. "You look like you're going to vomit again, Bug," Hayes said, dropping onto the mud beside Oliver with a heavy metallic clank. Oliver flinched, pulling his knees tighter to his chest. The human smelled of burnt cordite, old sweat, and the sharp, coppery tang of fresh blood. It was an overwhelming olfactory assault. "He is severely damaged," Oliver clicked, his translation matrix smoothing the rapid, nervous chittering of his vocal cords into Terran standard. "His internal organs are compromised, the staples, the chemicals. You are forcing a failing system to operate beyond its breaking point. He will die." Hayes unclipped his heavy helmet and set it in his lap, running a dirty hand over his short, bristled scalp. He looked at Bennett, who was currently attempting to reattach his damaged chest plate with shaking but determined hands. "Maybe," Hayes said softly. But he won't die right now. And right now is all that matters. Oliver didn't understand. Why not wait for an extraction drone? Call for a medical stasis pod. Hayes turned his head, his pale eyes locking on to Oliver. There was a profound, exhausted cynicism in his gaze. It wasn't the look of a hero. It was the look of a factory worker staring down a double shift. There are no drones coming, Oliver, Hayes said, the heavy syllables of the Colt name sounding strange in the human's mouth. The Creel jammed the orbital comms 10 minutes ago. The fleet is blind. And if we stay here, we're dead. The noise we just made? It's going to draw every stalker within 20 clicks. Hayes reached into a pouch and pulled out a small, foil-wrapped rectangle. He tore it open with his teeth, revealing a dense, brown block of something that looked like compressed dirt. He snapped it in half and held a piece out to Oliver. Eat. It tastes like boot leather and sorrow. But it's 4,000 calories. You're going to need it. Oliver stared at the ration. It smelled of synthetic proteins and harsh preservatives. His specialized digestive tract, designed for synthesized nutrient broths and cultivated flora, rebelled at the mere scent, but the gnawing emptiness in his 3 stomachs forced his hand. He took the block with 2 trembling fingers and took a small, hesitant bite. It was worse than leather. It was chalky, heavily salted, and coated the roof of his mouth in a layer of grease. He swallowed dryly, coughing as it scraped down his throat. Hayes chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He shoved the other half into his own mouth and chewed mechanically. We move in 5. Carter says Bennett can walk. If he can't, I carry him. If I can't, Riley carries him. And if she cannot? Oliver asked, morbidly fascinated by this brutal hierarchy of suffering. Hayes swallowed the heavy ration. Then we leave him a grenade and walk faster. Darkness on the ash plains did not fall gently. It slammed down like a vault door. The sickly orange glow of the toxic atmosphere faded into a suffocating, pitch-black void, thick with a creeping acidic fog. The temperature plummeted, turning the rain into razor-sharp sleet that pinged relentlessly off human armor and stung Oliver's exposed blue skin. They had been walking for 3 hours. Oliver's secondary joints were screaming. Colt physiology was built for agility and short bursts of speed, not for trudging through knee-deep, freezing mud under the crushing gravity of a hostile world. Every step required a conscious, agonizing effort. Mud sucked at his boots, trying to drag him down into the dark. Ahead of him, the humans moved like ghosts trapped in iron cages. They didn't use flashlights. The fog would only reflect the beams back, blinding them and acting as a beacon for the Creel. Instead, their helmets were sealed, relying on thermal and low-light optics. To Oliver, who possessed no such enhancements, they were just massive, hulking silhouettes, shifting through the grey soup. Hayes took the point, his heavy kinetic rifle held loosely but firmly at the ready. Riley covered the rear, walking backward for long stretches, the barrel of her heavy shotgun sweeping the darkness. Carter and Bennett were in the middle, flanking Oliver. Bennett's breathing was a rhythmic, terrifying sound in the quiet. Ha! Wheeze. Ha! Wheeze. Every inhalation sounded like tearing paper. He was leaning heavily on his rifle like a crutch, dragging his right leg slightly. The chemical stims were wearing off, and the reality of his shattered torso was crashing back down on him. But he didn't stop. He didn't ask for a break. He just kept moving, driven by a stubborn, primal refusal to lie down and die. Oliver tripped. His foot caught on a submerged root or a piece of buried shrapnel, and he pitched forward, splashing face first into the freezing slurry. He lay there for a moment, the cold seeping into his bones. His 3 hearts fluttered erratically. He was so tired. It would be so easy to just close his eyes, let the freezing mud numb his limbs, and wait for the void. The cult were philosophers, artists, thinkers. They were not beasts of burden. This world was too harsh, too ugly. A heavy hand gripped the collar of his uniform. Carter hauled him out of the mud with a single, sharp heave, standing him upright. The medic didn't speak. He just shoved Oliver roughly forward, a silent, brutal command to keep walking. "Contact," Hayes hissed over the localized radio frequency, his voice crackling with static. The entire column froze. Oliver stopped breathing. He strained his audio receptors, swiveling the delicate membranes on the sides of his head. At first, he heard nothing but the whistling of the wind and the pinging of sleet. Then, he felt it. A micro-vibration through the mud. A rhythmic, heavy thrum. Thrum. Click. Thrum. Click. Distance? Riley's voice was unnervingly calm in Oliver's earpiece. 200 meters, moving parallel to our flank, Hayes replied. Heavy chassis. Probably a hunter-killer pack. 3 signatures. They tracking us? Carter asked, keeping one hand firmly planted on Bennett's shoulder to keep the wounded man steady. Not yet, Hayes said. Wind is blowing our scent east. They're scanning south. Keep quiet. Keep moving. They altered their course, stepping carefully to minimize the squelch of mud. Oliver felt panic rising in his throat like bile. The Creel hunter-killers were nightmare machines, equipped with seismic sensors and thermal arrays. If they were spotted out here, in the open mud with no cover and a wounded man, it would be a massacre. He watched Riley. The human female was small compared to Hayes or Bennett, but she moved with a coiled, lethal tension. Her head was constantly swiveling, her helmeted gaze sweeping the impenetrable fog. She wasn't just relying on her optics. Oliver could see the way her shoulders twitched, the way she paused to test the wind. She was hunting the hunters. Suddenly, Riley threw a closed fist into the air. The column halted instantly. "Movement," she whispered over the comms. "Close. 50 meters. 9 o'clock. Oliver stared into the grey void to his left. He saw nothing. "I don't have thermal on it," Hayes muttered. "It's buried," Riley said, her voice dropping an octave. "I felt the earth shift. Stalker. Creel stalkers. The biomechanical horrors that burrowed beneath the ash, waiting for vibrations." Before anyone could react, the ground beneath Carter exploded. Mud, sleet, and shattered rock erupted into the air as a massive, segmented metallic worm burst from the soil. It wasn't entirely mechanical. Glistening, pale, synthetic flesh pulsed between the steel plating. It let out a deafening, digital shriek, a sound that bypassed Oliver's ears and vibrated directly in his teeth. The stalker's jaw unhinged, revealing concentric rings of spinning, monomolecular teeth. It lunged at Carter. The medic didn't have his rifle raised. He shoved Bennett violently backward, throwing the wounded man out of the path of the jaws, and took the brunt of the impact himself. The stalker's head slammed into Carter's chest plate, the force throwing the heavy human through the air like a discarded toy. Carter hit the mud with a sickening crunch, his armor sparking. "Contact left," Hayes roared, his heavy kinetic rifle barking to life. Boom, 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 boom! The muzzle flashes strobed like lightning in the fog, blinding Oliver. The deafening roar of the weapon in the open air was a physical pressure against his skull. Slugs slammed into the stalker's side, shattering chitin and tearing through synthetic flesh. But the massive worm barely flinched. It whipped its heavy tail, striking Hayes and sending the massive squad leader tumbling into the dark. Oliver scrambled backward on all 6 of his limbs, sliding through the mud, a high-pitched keen of terror escaping his throat. The stalker turned, its optical sensors glowing a furious blood red through the mist. It locked onto Oliver. He was paralyzed. His brain screamed at his body to run, but his muscles were locked in a primitive fear response. He watched the massive, spinning teeth descend toward him, smelling the rancid, chemical breath of the machine. A shadow stepped between Oliver and the jaws. Riley didn't dive out of the way. She planted her boots wide, sinking deep into the mud for leverage, and brought her heavy shotgun up. She didn't aim for the armored head. She waited until the jaws were inches from her helmet, until the machine opened its maw to swallow her. She shoved the barrel of the shotgun directly down the stalker's throat and pulled the trigger. The detonation was muffled by the machine's internal organs, but the result was spectacular. The heavy, explosive slug detonated inside the stalker's cranial casing. Black fluid and vaporized synthetic brain matter blew out of the gaps in its armor. The stalker thrashed violently, its death throes erratic and devastating. The massive head snapped sideways, slamming into Riley's shoulder. Oliver heard the distinct, sickening pop of bone dislocating. Riley was thrown backward, landing hard in the mud beside Oliver. The headless stalker collapsed, its segmented body twisting into a tight, twitching knot before going still. Silence rushed back in, heavy and ringing. Oliver stared at Riley. She was lying on her back, breathing heavily. Her right arm hung at a grotesque angle, the shoulder joint clearly out of its socket. "Riley!" Hayes yelled, emerging from the fog. His armor was dented, and he was limping, but his rifle was still up. "I'm good," Riley grunted. Her voice was strained, tight with agony. Oliver watched in absolute disbelief as she sat up. She didn't reach for her medical pouch. She didn't call for Carter. She looked at her dangling arm, let out a short, harsh breath, and grabbed her own wrist with her good hand. She dragged herself over to the shattered bulk of the dead stalker. She jammed the dislocated shoulder against the hard steel of the machine's chassis, gritted her teeth, and violently twisted her torso. Crack! Riley let out a sharp, feral scream, squeezing her eyes shut. She slumped against the dead machine, panting, her chest heaving. Slowly, she rolled her shoulder. It clicked wetly, but it moved. She picked up her shotgun with her left hand. Oliver felt his reality fracture. He crawled toward her, his 4 hands shaking so badly he could barely support his own weight. "Why?" he clicked, his voice a frantic whisper. "Why did you do that? It was targeting me. I am a non-combatant. I am a liability. Tactical logic dictates you abandon dead weight to preserve the combat effectiveness of the unit." Riley looked down at him. Her helmet visor was cracked, revealing one eye. It was bloodshot, exhausted, and ringed with dirt. "Tactical logic," Riley spat, the words tasting foul in her mouth. "That's cult thinking. That's why your people are getting slaughtered out here." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a harsh, ragged whisper. "We don't fight because of logic, Oliver. We don't throw ourselves in front of meat grinders because a computer told us it's the most efficient way to win. We do it because you're breathing. And as long as you're breathing, you belong to us. And we don't let the dark take what's ours." Oliver stared into that single, bloodshot eye. He saw no grand philosophy there, no elegant, evolved morality. He saw only a terrifying, possessive pack instinct, a violent empathy born of a species that had clawed its way to the top of its own brutal food chain, not by being the smartest, but by being the most fiercely loyal to its own. They didn't just want to survive. They wanted to drag everything they claimed through the fire with them, kicking and screaming if necessary. "Doc!" Hayes barked, kneeling beside the medic. Carter groaned, rolling over in the mud. His chest plate was caved in, but he pushed himself up onto his elbows. "Ribs are cracked. Armor took the brunt." He coughed, spitting a glob of red onto the ash. "I'm functional." "Bennett!" Hayes called out. From the fog, Bennett emerged. He was dragging his right leg entirely now, leaning entirely on his rifle. The The staples in his gut had torn, and fresh blood was leaking through the thick medical glue, running down his thigh to pool in his boot. His face was a skull-like mask of pain. "Still kicking, boss," Bennett gasped, forcing a horrible, bloody grin. Hayes nodded once. He didn't offer sympathy. He didn't tell Bennett to rest. He turned his back to the wounded man and racked the bolt of his rifle. "Extraction point is 3 clicks north," Hayes said, his voice hard. "We walk. If you fall, crawl. If you can't crawl, scream, and we'll drag you." Riley hauled herself to her feet, wincing as her newly relocated shoulder bore the weight of her armor. Carter hobbled over to Bennett, throwing the dying man's arm over his own uninjured shoulder, taking the weight. Oliver slowly stood. The cold mud dripped from his uniform. His 3 hearts were beating in perfect, terrifying unison now. The panic was gone, replaced by a cold, heavy realization. He was walking with monsters, broken, bleeding, irrational beasts who defied nature, physics and logic, just to spite the universe. They were hideous. They were magnificent. Oliver stepped in line behind them, placing his delicate 4-toed boots into the heavy, deep tracks left by the humans. The fog swallowed them whole, but for the first time since the drop pods fell, Oliver didn't look at the darkness. He kept his eyes fixed on the scarred, bloody armor in front of him, following the scent of iron, sweat, and survival straight into the abyss. Fatigue stopped being a physical sensation and became a living, breathing entity draped over Oliver's back. It chewed at the ligaments in his secondary knees. It whispered in his audio receptors, urging him to lie face down in the toxic slurry and let the ash bury him. They marched for what felt like standard cycles, though Oliver's internal chronometer told him it had only been 40 Terran minutes. The environment was actively trying to digest them. The acidic fog thickened, clinging to their armor like cobwebs, eating away at the synthetic seals. The air tasted of sulfur and rust. Every inhalation burned the sensitive mucous membranes of Oliver's respiratory tract, making him cough up thin, blue phlegm. Ahead of him, the human formation was deteriorating. Bennett was no longer walking, he was being dragged. His right arm was looped over Carter's shoulder, his left over Hayes's. The wounded man's boots carved deep, sluggish trenches in the mud. He was entirely silent now. The wisecracking bravado bled completely dry. The only sounds he made were wet, gurgling hitches in his throat. Oliver could smell him. The medical glue had failed. The scent of copper had soured into something dark and foul. The unmistakable odor of necrotic tissue and ruptured bowels. The creel blade had done more damage than a simple puncture. It had left a slow-acting neuroacid that was currently eating Bennett from the inside out. "Hold!" Hayes rasped. The squad stopped. Hayes and Carter carefully lowered Bennett into the shallow crater of a previous artillery strike. The mud here was baked hard, offering a momentary reprieve from the sucking sludge. Riley dropped to one knee on the crater's edge, her heavy shotgun leveled at the grey wall of fog. She was shivering. The violent relocation of her shoulder had taken a massive toll. Her movements, usually sharp and predatory, were sluggish. Carter fell to his knees beside Bennett, ripping his medical pouch open. His thick fingers fumbled, slick with rain, and his own blood leaking from his cracked ribs. He pulled out a syringe filled with a thick, amber liquid. "No!" Bennett gasped, his hand shooting out to grip Carter's wrist. His grip was remarkably weak. "Save it. Don't waste the adrenaline on a dead battery." Carter yanked his wrist free, his face twisting into an ugly scowl. "Shut up. I decide when you're dead." He jammed the needle directly through the mesh of Bennett's undersuit into his thigh. Bennett arched his back, a silent, agonizing scream tearing at his jaw. His eyes rolled back, showing only dirty, bloodshot whites. Oliver stood at the edge of the crater, his 4 hands twitching helplessly. In the cult military, a soldier in Bennett's condition would be granted the mercy of the void, a painless, instant injection of neurotoxins to spare them the indignity of a slow death. "Why are you prolonging his suffering?" Oliver whispered, his vocal cords clicking erratically. "His systems are failing. The acid is in his bloodstream. You are torturing him for no tactical gain." Hayes turned his head slowly. The squad leader's face was a mask of soot, dried blood, and absolute exhaustion. His pale eyes were flat, devoid of the furious energy they had held an hour ago. "Because he's still breathing, Bug," Hayes said softly. "You don't get to quit until the heart stops. That's the contract." "It is irrational." "Yeah," Hayes agreed, looking down at his blood-soaked gauntlets. "It is." Bennett let out a long, rattling exhale, his head lolling to the side. The amber liquid was forcing his heart to pump, forcing his lungs to draw air. But his body was a broken vessel. He opened his eyes, focusing on Hayes. "Boss," Bennett whispered, his voice sounding like dry leaves crushing under a boot. "Can't feel my legs." Hayes didn't flinch. He didn't offer false hope. He just unclipped a heavy, cylindrical fragmentation grenade from his chest rig and pressed it into Bennett's hand. He folded Bennett's limp fingers over the cold metal. "I know, kid," Hayes said, his voice dropping to a gravelly murmur. "Hold on to this. Pull the pin. Keep the spoon depressed. If your grip gives out, well, you won't hear the boom anyway." Bennett cracked a horrific, bloody smile. His teeth were entirely stained red. "Gonna make a mess." "You always do." Hayes stood up. The sound of his knee joints popping echoed loudly in the quiet. He looked at Carter, then at Riley. A silent communication passed between the 3 humans. A grim, fatalistic acknowledgement. They were leaving him. They had carried him until he physically could not be moved, and now they were leaving him in the mud. Oliver felt a profound, confusing ache in his primary chest cavity. He had been repulsed by their brutality, terrified of their violence, but watching this brutal severing of the pack sickened him in a completely different way. "We need a rear guard," Bennett wheezed, his thumb finding the pin of the grenade. With a sickeningly weak tug, he pulled it free. The metal pinged softly against his armor. He held the lever down with a trembling grip. "Go, before the roaches catch the scent." "Dust off is 1 click north," Hayes told the squad, refusing to look back down at Bennett. "Double time." Riley tapped her fist twice against her chest plate, a silent salute, and turned into the fog. Carter lingered for a fraction of a second, his jaw working as if he wanted to spit, before turning and following her. Hayes grabbed Oliver by the collar, hauling him out of his frozen stupor. "Move!" They left the crater. They didn't look back. Oliver scrambled alongside Hayes, his long legs pumping desperately to match the human's heavy, grinding pace. The silence behind them was heavier than the fog. 10 minutes later, the earth shook. A muffled, heavy thump echoed through the ash, followed by a shock wave that rippled through the mud, rattling the bones in Oliver's feet. No one stopped. No one said a word. Riley just racked the pump of her shotgun, ejecting a spent, phantom shell into the mud, and walked faster. The extraction point wasn't a reinforced bunker or a shielded landing pad. It was a graveyard. A massive cult dreadnought had crashed here decades ago, its hull half buried in the acidic mire. What remained was a rusted, jagged spine of twisted metal thrusting into the toxic sky. It offered cover, but no shelter. Hayes shoved Oliver toward a massive, curved slab of rusted armor plating. "Get in there. Keep your head down. Don't come out until you hear turbine engines." Oliver crawled into the dark crevice, pulling his knees to his chest. He was trembling violently. The cold had finally breached his internal thermal regulation. He was freezing to death. Outside, the humans began setting their meager defenses. They didn't have auto turrets or motion sensors. They had 2 heavy rifles, a shotgun, and sheer spite. Carter dropped his medical bag in the mud, pulled a combat knife from his boot, and began digging a trench directly in front of their position, using the blade like a trowel. Riley climbed up the jagged metal spine of the dreadnought, finding a perch 20 feet above the ground. Hayes stood at the entrance of their makeshift perimeter, staring into the grey void. "Mags," Hayes called out, not looking away from the fog. "3," Carter grunted, piling wet mud into a low parapet. "4 shells," Riley's voice floated down from above. Hayes checked his heavy kinetic rifle. He pulled the magazine, weighed it in his hand, and slammed it back home. "Half a drum, make 'em count, aim for the joints." The waiting was a physical torture. Oliver squeezed his eyes shut, listening to the heavy, labored breathing of the 2 humans below. Carter was wheezing badly now, the cracked ribs puncturing something vital. Every breath sounded wet. Then, the fog began to glow. It wasn't a natural light. It was a sickly, violent purple, pulsing through the dense ash. The clicking started a second later. Not a few isolated sounds, but a deafening, overwhelming wave of mechanical noise. Click-clack, whir, thrum, thousands of metallic limbs moving in unison. The Creel swarm had found them. "Contact!" Riley yelled. Her shotgun boomed. The flash illuminated the fog for a fraction of a second, revealing a nightmare. A tide of rusted metal, spinning blades, and glowing purple optics surging toward the dreadnought. The slug tore through the chassis of a heavy walker, flipping it backward, but 3 more scrambled over its smoking remains. Hayes opened fire. The heavy kinetic rifle roared, spitting a solid line of tracer fire into the mass. The noise in the confined space of the wreck was deafening. Oliver clapped all 4 hands over his ears, burying his face in his knees. The ground vibrated violently under the sheer volume of incoming fire and the heavy metallic thuds of falling Creel. Carter was firing in measured, precise bursts. "Pop-pop! Pop-pop! Left flank!" Carter roared, his voice cracking. A stalker vaulted over a rusted beam, bypassing Hayes's firing line. It landed directly in front of Carter, its scythe-like arms raising for a killing's blow. Carter didn't have time to aim. He lunged forward, throwing his entire body weight into the machine. He drove his combat knife upward, sliding the blade perfectly beneath the stalker's armored chin plate, severing its primary hydraulic line. Black fluid sprayed across Carter's visor in a thick arc, but the machine's momentum carried it forward. The heavy chassis collapsed on top of Carter, pinning him to the mud. "Doc!" Hayes bellowed, turning his rifle. "Keep firing front!" Carter screamed, his voice muffled beneath a ton of dead metal. He was trapped, but his hand snaked out from under the chassis, blind firing his sidearm into the approaching swarm. Riley's shotgun went dry with a hollow click. Oliver looked up. A flying drone, completely silent and moving with terrifying speed, swooped down from the fog directly toward Riley's perch. It didn't fire weapons. It just extended 4 heavy monomolecular grapnels. Riley saw it a second too late. She swung the empty shotgun like a club, but the drone was too fast. The grapnels slammed into her chest plate, locking tight. With a mechanical whine, the drone abruptly ascended. Riley was ripped from her perch. She didn't scream. She reached down, drew her sidearm, and began firing point-blank into the drone's underbelly as she was hauled into the acidic sky. Bang! 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 The drone sparked violently, its repulsor engines sputtering. It began to spin out of control, trailing thick black smoke. Oliver watched in horror as the machine and the human strapped to it plummeted into the dense fog, vanishing entirely. The dull crunch of impact echoed a moment later. "Riley!" Hayes roared. The squad leader was losing his mind. The cold, calculated killer was gone, replaced by a frenzied beast. His rifle clicked dry. He didn't bother reloading. He grabbed the barrel, which was glowing dull orange from heat, and swung the heavy weapon like a sledgehammer. He smashed the skull of an approaching walker, the stock of the rifle shattering on impact. He threw the broken weapon at the next machine, drew his trench knife, and waded directly into the swarm. It was butchery. Hayes was entirely surrounded by spinning blades and glowing purple lasers. He moved with a heavy, drunken violence, stabbing, tearing, punching. His armor sparked as lasers carved glowing trenches across his back. A serrated blade caught him behind the knee, bringing him down to the mud. He didn't stay down. He grabbed the offending blade, ignoring the fact that it was slicing straight through the palm of his gauntlet, and drove his knife into the machine's optical cluster. Oliver couldn't breathe. The air in his hiding spot was entirely displaced by the stench of burning ozone and vaporized blood. The humans were dying. They were being dismantled piece by piece, ground down by the sheer, inexhaustible weight of the Creel war machine. Hayes was on his knees now. 3 stalkers loomed over him, their scythes raised. The human was covered in so much black fluid and red blood that his armor was unrecognizable. He was wheezing. His head hung low. He had nothing left. Oliver felt a strange, terrifying sensation in his chest. It wasn't fear. The fear was gone, burned away by the sheer absurdity of the violence he was witnessing. It was a sickening, electric jolt of adrenaline. He looked at his long, delicate fingers. He looked at a discarded human sidearm lying in the mud 3 feet away, dropped by Carter when he was pinned. Oliver moved. He didn't think about cult philosophy. He didn't think about his non-combatant status. He simply threw himself forward, sliding through the mud on his belly. He snatched the heavy, clumsy human pistol with 2 hands. It was incredibly heavy, designed for thick, calloused grips, not slender, multi-jointed fingers. He aimed it at the closest stalker, standing over Hayes. He squeezed the trigger. The recoil nearly broke his wrists. The pistol barked loudly, bucking wildly in his grasp. The heavy slug struck the stalker directly in the knee joint. It wasn't a kill shot, but the kinetic impact forced the machine to buckle, its scythe swinging wildly off target, missing Hayes's neck by a fraction of an inch. Hayes snapped his head around, staring at Oliver through a cracked, blood-smeared visor. Before either of them could react, a sound tore through the battlefield. It wasn't a roar. It was a high-pitched, whining shriek that vibrated the fillings in Oliver's teeth. The fog above them swirled violently, ripped apart by twin columns of blue, scorching fire. A Terran dropship dropped out of the sky like a stone, its heavy repulsor engines baking the mud instantly. It didn't wait for a clear landing zone. It slammed down right in the middle of the Creel swarm, crushing 2 heavy walkers beneath its landing struts. The side doors blew open before the ship had even settled. A pair of heavy rotary cannons deployed from the doorframes. The gunners didn't yell. They just squeezed the triggers. A solid wall of depleted uranium rained down on the ash plains. The noise was absolute, a sustained, ripping thunder that turned the charging Creel into a fine, metallic mist. "Get up!" a voice barked from the ship's loudspeakers. Hayes didn't need to be told twice. He surged to his feet, a roaring, bloody spectre. He grabbed Carter by the chest plate, dragging the trapped medic out from under the dead machine with a horrifying display of raw strength. Oliver was paralyzed again, deafened by the rotary cannons, staring blankly at the ramp extending toward him. Hayes was there in a second. The human didn't ask if he was okay. He grabbed Oliver by the harness, physically lifting him off his feet, and threw him onto the metal ramp of the dropship. Oliver hit the grated floor hard, sliding toward the back of the bay. He scrambled upright, gasping for breath in the sudden, clean air of the ship's interior. Hayes hauled Carter over the threshold, dropping the medic heavily onto the deck. The squad leader stood on the ramp, his chest heaving, his armor dripping with gore. He stared out into the swirling ash, searching. "Riley!" Hayes screamed into the comms, his voice cracking entirely. "Riley, sound off!" Static. The crew chief of the dropship hit a button, and the heavy metal doors began to slide shut. "We're out of time, Sergeant. We're taking heavy fire." "Hold the door!" Hayes roared, turning and physically wedging his shoulder against the hydraulic door, trying to stop it from closing. The metal groaned in protest. "She's out there. We don't leave her." "She's gone, boss." Carter spoke from the floor. He was coughing up thick ropes of blood, his helmet off. His face was entirely grey. "She fell from 20 feet. She's gone. Let the door close." Hayes froze. The frantic, animalistic energy drained from him in a single, devastating instant. He stared out into the toxic fog one last time. He pulled his shoulder back. The heavy doors slammed shut, sealing with a pneumatic hiss. The noise of the battlefield was instantly cut off, replaced by the humming of the engines and the heavy vibration of ascent. The interior of the dropship smelled of ozone, old sweat, and sterile iodine. It was harshly lit by red emergency strips, casting long, grotesque shadows across the bulkheads. Oliver sat curled in a corner, his 4 knees pulled tightly to his chest. His primary hearts were beating so fast they felt like they were vibrating against his ribs. The human pistol was still clutched in his lower right hand, his finger stiff and locked around the trigger guard. He stared at it as if it were a venomous serpent. He had fired a weapon. He, a cult of the 4th caste, had actively participated in kinetic violence. The realization made him want to vomit again. But his stomachs were completely empty. Across the bay, the remnants of the squad sat in silence. Carter was strapped into a medical crash seat. An automated trauma dock was whirring over him, injecting synthetic platelets and sealing the massive internal hemorrhaging caused by his crushed ribs. The medic's eyes were closed, his breathing shallow but steady. He looked like a corpse. Hayes was sitting on the floor plating, his back against the bulkhead. He hadn't taken his helmet off. He sat completely motionless, a gargoyle carved out of soot, blood, and scarred metal. The heavy trench knife was still gripped tightly in his right hand. There were no cheers of victory. There were no relieved smiles or backslapping. They had survived, but survival in the human military did not look like a triumph. It looked like an exhaustion so profound it bordered on death itself. Oliver watched Hayes. He remembered the stories broadcast on the cult network about human mercenaries. They were painted as mindless berserkers, hounds unleashed upon the enemy with no thought for consequence or morality. They were a necessary evil, a tool to be used and discarded. But looking at the broken, silent figure against the wall, Oliver realized how profoundly wrong the cult were. The humans weren't mindless. They felt every ounce of the horror they inflicted. They absorbed the violence of the galaxy, internalized it, and let it poison them so that the rest of the coalition didn't have to. They fought with a terrifying, agonizing love for one another. A pack bond so strong that a man would hold onto a live grenade just to buy his squad 10 minutes, and a woman would dive into a swarm of blades to protect an alien who looked down on her. They were beautiful. They were hideous. Hayes's helmet slowly turned toward Oliver. The polarized visor was cracked, and through the fractured glass, Oliver could see a single, pale blue eye. "You did good, Bug," Hayes's voice crackled through the external speakers of his helmet. It was soft, entirely hollowed out. "You kept your head, kept breathing." Oliver uncurled his stiff fingers, letting the heavy pistol clatter against the metal deck. He looked at his shaking hands. "I broke protocol. I fired a kinetic weapon." Hayes let out a slow, rattling breath. "There is no protocol in the mud, Oliver. There's just who goes home and who stays." The human slowly reached up and unclasped his helmet, pulling it off. His face was a ruin. The gash on his cheek had opened wide, and his skin was the color of dirty chalk. He looked 20 years older than he had when they dropped from the sky. He rested his head back against the cold metal wall and closed his eyes. "We're going home now," Hayes whispered, more to himself than to Oliver. "Just going home." Oliver didn't speak again. He turned his head to the small, reinforced porthole window of the dropship. Outside, the ash plains of the planet fell away, swallowed by the thick, toxic clouds. He was leaving the nightmare behind. He was returning to the clean, sterile halls of the cult fleet, to filtered water and quiet contemplation. But as he stared into the grey void, he knew he would never truly leave. The smell of battery acid and crushed mint would haunt him forever. He carried the heavy, brutal weight of humanity with him now, a ghost stitched to his shadow. The broadcast light blinked off, casting the studio back into a soft, sterile silence. Oliver sat in the chair, his 4 hands resting heavily on the table. The interviewer across from him was entirely speechless, her skin pale, her datapad forgotten on the desk. She had wanted a story of victory. He had given her an autopsy. He slowly pushed himself up from the chair. His secondary joints ached, a phantom pain that echoed the deep, agonizing chill of the mud. He walked out of the studio without another word, the heavy silence following him like a shroud. He didn't need to explain further. The galaxy had heard the truth. They finally understood the cost of their pristine survival. They finally knew what monsters were made of, and why, when the darkness closed in, you prayed for a monster to stand in front of you. If this raw account of the Terran infantry shook you to your core, don't let the broadcast end here. Hit that like button to honor the fallen. Share this transmission across the network so others know the brutal price of our survival. And subscribe to the channel for more unclassified archives straight from the darkest front lines. The galaxy is cold, unforgiving, and built on the sacrifices of those willing to bleed in the mud. Stand with us, keep your eyes open, and together we survive the void. Drop a comment below for the fallen.